say, Amen. It always strikes me so deep when we start that prayer. We say, may we see the day when war and bloodshed cease. We live in this country where, we don't really ever see war firsthand. But it's throughout the world. There's so many wars going on all the time in the world. Anyways, these tefillot are striking me very deeply this morning. I'm going to share one thought about this week's Parsha, and so I wish you a Shabbat Shalom as we enter this moment of study together. I'd like you to ask yourself one question, and that is, are you a rule follower? I don't think I am by nature, but on some level I really am, because I do enjoy living within what we refer to often as the Daled Amot of Halakha, the 4 cubits of Jewish law. And while I'm part of a movement that's forever expanding those 4 cubits, pushing those boundaries as far as I can, as far as we can, I still consider myself a rule follower. And so I ask you to ask yourself that question, and that is, are you a rule follower? And if so, are you following someone who is a rule follower? You see, I was born into a family where both my parents, I believe, were hippies. My father, though a conservative rabbi, my mother an extraordinary educator, really were hippies in their core. And I think that's what forced me to become more conservative with a small c. My father was a natural rebel, and so I became more conservative in response to him. I found myself to be more of a rule follower, except in one location, and that is when the rule just doesn't make any sense. And so I would question those, as we all do in our lives, and we all have to do as we move forward, as we build a better society, as we build a more perfect union. We have to ask ourselves the question of, do the rules still apply? Are those rules correct? Do they make sense? And then we have to find within ourselves our ultimate personal truth. So just let me give you one example from this week's Parsha about a rule that sounds like it makes sense, but in reality is actually absurd. We read in this week's Parsha, ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, yad tachat yad, regel tachat ragel. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a leg for a leg. And the Torah is immediately reinterpreted by our rabbis. And that's what happens. It happens all the time throughout our tradition, and that is, we learn lessons from the Torah that seem to make absolute sense, but then when we think about them, our rabbis say maybe it's not such a great approach. And that's exactly what happens here. So in the year 1782 BCE, Hammurabi writes a code. And in that code, he puts forth this rule: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And it becomes the standard of civilized society for probably 1,000 years before our rabbis have a chance to reinterpret it. Before that can occur, those words are canonized in our tradition. The Torah does what the Torah does so well, so brilliantly. It surveys the around culture. It surveys the influences that are best and then adapts it for us as Jews. It refines the world around. It builds on the world that it was born into. Hammurabi says an eye for an eye. And in that way, Hammurabi was teaching that every response has to be proportionate. Every response has to be proportionate. And that's an extraordinary rule. And that's one that makes sense. So an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You don't kill somebody because they did you damage. It reminds me of a quote that Sean Connery in the movie The Untouchables back in 1987 said. Sean Connery, I'm not going to do a Sean Connery impersonation because I'm not very good at it. But he said, if they put one of our guys in the hospital, we put one of theirs in the morgue. They send one of yours to the hospital, you send two of theirs to the morgue. That was Sean Connery's way of saying in that movie that you have to be disproportionate in your response in order to be able to get what you want. Living in that brutal and ancient world, eye for an eye was an innovation. It was progress. It made perfectly good sense. But immediately, almost as soon as the ink dries, the rabbis say, no, think about it for a minute. You can't actually mean an eye for an eye. If those words really meant that, we'd have a lot of people walking around without eyes, without teeth, without hands, without feet. And so the rabbis say, no, it can't be that way. It's not true. If you hurt somebody, then you have to in some way compensate them. But it can't be direct. And so the rabbis, of course, teach us, ayin tachat ayin, ma hatam mimona mishalem. The rabbis say, no, you don't poke out someone's eye because they poked out your eye. You pay them. You compensate them financially if that's possible. It's a logical step forward that seemingly comes without objection. It's an inconsequential alteration, but it's necessary in order for us to progress forward. The law has to evolve. Clearly, it's a divergence from the pshat of the Torah. Clearly, it's a change, an alteration to the plain meaning of the text. But we can't become literalists in the way that we read Torah because that makes us fundamentalists. And fanatics are dangerous in this world. After all, anyone in a right mind could not possibly have defended the original position, which would certainly have left so many maimed and hurt. But know that when emotions run high, anger runs deep, and bloodthirst is real, and it's a natural reaction to being scarred. But it cannot be our response. Choose your truth over your visceral, base, animal reaction. So again, I turn to my Hasidic master, Rav Moshe Teitelbaum, the Yismach Moshe. And on this verse, Rav Moshe Teitelbaum teaches us something beautiful. Torah shebichtav hu hadin, mipi agvura shamanu. He says that the Torah that is written in the 5 books of Moses comes from the Almighty, and it speaks of justice. The Torah sheba'al peh hu rachamim. But the oral law speaks of compassion. Im kein shurat hadin haya ayin mamash. If we read the law actually, according to the letter of the law, Shurat Hadin, then yes, it means an eye exactly that you are to poke out a person's eye if they poke out yours. Rak shebal peh, Mikel, mitzad harachamim. But the Torah sheba'al peh, the Mishnah, the oral law, teaches us, let's be a little more lenient, mekil, mitzad harachamim, in order to be more compassionate. The Torah comes from the perspective of what the law is. The Torah sheba'al peh, the Mishnah says, but add to the law a level of compassion, or as we might say, rachmanis. The Mishnah begs us to find leniency and to permit our voice of compassion to prevail. Torah sheba'al peh, the Mishnah comes to balance the Torah shebichtav. Oral law comes to balance the written law. Life isn't about making everything fair and balanced. It's about cultivating forgiveness and the extraordinary strength and gigantic ability we have to forgive. To be clear, I'm not advocating for what the Gospel Matthew suggests, turn the other cheek. I much prefer the adage, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. But there must be compassion in the world. We have to pursue justice. Evil has to, on some front, be confronted, but not given into. We must find ways to stop violence that contributes to a cycle of brutality. I'm not suggesting a type of justice that is blind. I'm suggesting a type of justice that's balanced with compassion. On Monday morning, October 2nd, 2006, a gunman enters a room in an Amish school in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. 25 students, horrified. Charles Roberts walks into the room with an assault rifle, forces the teacher to leave, and goes forward to slaughter so many of those children. Fresh from the funeral where they buried their own children, the grieving Amish accounted for over half of the 75 people who attended the killer's funeral. Robert's widow was deeply moved by their presence as Amish families greeted her and her 3 children. The forgiveness went beyond talk and graveside presence, since the Amish people also supported a fund for the shooter's family. The book that chronicled this event was called Amish Grace. And in that book, the Amish instructed the world that when a group of Amish school children were taken hostage and killed in their classroom, their parents and the entire Amish community of Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, could stun the world by immediately forgiving the killer. We have to walk in unison together to do good, not to do bad. This morning, the Chazan read, Lo acharei rabim liraot, we ought not follow the masses to do bad. Lo ta'aneh al riv lintot acharei rabim lahatot. Don't follow those who seek to pervert justice. You have to have your own independent mind. You have to say to yourself, am I a rule follower? And do those rules make sense? And if they don't follow the masses to do wrong. One of the songs that I heard so often growing up in my house was written and performed by Johnny Mathis, and it was called If We Only Have Love. In fact, I can still hear my father singing the words, if we only had love, we could melt all the guns and give a new world to our daughters and sons. I know it's pie in the sky. I know it's an unattainable or fanciful hope or a plan. But what else do you expect to get here in this shul, in this holy space? Usually I begin my remarks every week with something from the news, something from popular culture, or even just a funny story from real life. Sometimes I'm subtle about it and expecting you just to get it, and at other times I'm a little more blunt. I do this to draw you in, and then I transition to a message from the weekly Parsha. And the subtle but inescapable message is that our Torah applies to our personal lives. Each week I try to make the case that Torah is relevant and modern. And then I'm always closing the sale by asking you to be deeply moved in a personal and real way that's necessary so that you can live this Jewish life that is such a powerful way of living. And then I realize, I'm preaching to the choir, those of you who tune in because you know the message you're going to receive and that you want to feel uplifted by it. You want to be further encouraged to have the strength of conviction to do what's right in your heart. I wish there was a way we could influence others in the world. So maybe we do. Maybe just in our small actions, just the small group of us who do this, can change the trajectory of those around us. Maybe they will be influenced by our sacred tradition, our sacred legacy, and that will be our gift to humanity. Torah in its broadest strokes. If we only had love, to embrace without fear. We will kiss with our eyes, we will sleep without tears. If we only have love, we can reach those in pain. We can heal all our wounds. We can use our own names. Shabbat Shalom. I think we're ready to conclude.